I'm Blake McCulley from Cross-Eyed Airbrushing in Calgary, Canada, and today we're going to summon the dragon. We're going to try to figure out how to make a dragon cool. Finding reference for a dragon is very difficult. There's a lot of poor reference out there, a lot of really fluffy sort of romantic versions of dragons. I don't know, my clients don't sit down for that. They need a dragon that is really aggressive, you know. The same approach as what we were talking about with skulls in our prior videos. It's all about making it evil and nasty. And if you can't make your dragon kill another dragon or kill that knight, then all you got is a dead dragon. Now the beauty of this situation is nobody's seen a dragon. Nobody can argue what a dragon looks like, although we do have a lot of preconceived notions of what a dragon should be. There's medieval reference, there's Japanese dragons, there's a pile of fantasy art that's on stupid romance novels. There's even a lot of DVD and computer type dragons in game situations. There's a couple even magazines out on dragons. You are going to find some cool ones in there and you're going to get influenced by them. But I like to pull a lot of stuff from real life. The reptile world and the dinosaur world is where I pull a lot of my reference from. I just don't like a lot of the fantasy dragons that are out there. It's hard not to be influenced by all the stereotypes out there. Movies have really stereotyped dragons to the point where it's a formula almost. You know, that knight in shining armor. Now, there's a lot of characteristics to a dragon. They have horns, they have scales, they have fins, they have moldings to them. They sometimes have a cheesy-ass mustache. This is probably influenced by the Japanese one. They also usually have a beard. Most dragons have a toy by mythology. So you have to fight the movies, the mythology, and then the realism that you're trying to achieve here and make it plausible and believable. They also have a lot of claws, flared nostrils. They need big nostrils so they can breathe in and take in a lot of oxygen to output fire. So there's a lot of characteristics you got to figure out on this. And if you don't know what it's about, it's hard to do the actual project without fully understanding what you're up against. When I start a project and I have a dragon that I'm going to create, quite often I don't take my influence from the fantasy world. I've already been inundated with that enough. I know what they look like based on what I've seen. Now I want to try to pull and create something a little badder, a little meaner. So I really turn to the reptile world. There's so many cool things in nature that you can pull and add to it. It's almost like building a hybrid. And that's where you have to be creative and rather than just taking a reference and copying it. The purpose of this DVD is for you to understand how a dragon works, how a dragon looks. That's the important part. So I've advanced this project to this point. So let's go summon the dragon. Now I spent about an hour and a half drawing this guy out. I've modified him a little bit since I transferred him onto our panel. I just put a cool hand up close, extreme perspective. I don't know, I didn't like those stylized fins that you get on the outside of a lot of dragons, so I gave him a ratty sort of beard. Same down here. You know, he's a little tattered, a little worn. I'm going to have him a little beat up because I think a lot of dragons go through battle. I've actually sculled a little bit of him as well. He has a nasal cavity in here as opposed to having flared nostrils that are skin tone. But throughout this project, I'm going to take on about 5 or 6 different textures. Different types of scales, different types of plating, different types of horns. So when he gets done, he's actually going to be quite a mess. He's not going to be very cohesive because we're going to have little sections of belly that's soft going into plates on the underside of the belly. Then we're going to have scales down here that are more like the fish scales that overlap. And I'll explain these a little bit. Then I'll get into soft textured ones, and then into pebbling, then into a little bit of horning. So there's going to be a lot of different surface that we're going to treat this guy with. And the end result's going to be an absolute mess, but the object is for you to learn off of it. So we've taken this badass here and we've tried to transfer him on here. I enlarged my original copy a little bit bigger, made my own stencil kit. I laid him down, cut him out, and then cut out the outline. I've transferred my stencil, my positive, onto the tape. I've sprayed an outline. Then I've cut out my whole outline around the whole outside, keeping in my negative spots. Now this will be my background. This is a black panel, so the white is going to stand out on it. I'm not going to identify a background into this project. The first color I used was Sealer White over the black panel, and it's a Series 4000 Auto Wear colors. Then I followed up with 3 coats of transparent white from the 4200 series. Then I reduced my mixture 20% with 4011 reducer. This is also called the Flash Reducer Fast Dry on the product code. I want to introduce you to a lot of different references for dragons. This is a gaming magazine that has compiled a lot of dragons. Some of them are artistic renderings by artists, some are computer-generated images. We will also find some sculptures in there as well. A lot of 3D sculptures of dragons are a great reference to work from. And here's a good example right here. This magazine can also be found at Borders, Barnes & Nobles, and other magazine stores. A second source of information is dinosaurs. The best place to find dinosaur references is in the kids section of a bookstore. Let's open this up and have a look. This is a computer-generated T-Rex. The reference is amazing. Look at the teeth, look at the flesh, look at all the reflection into the flesh tones. I think this is an invaluable reference. Don't do yourself a disservice by passing up computer-generated imagery. Then have a look at this. We have a skull of a T-Rex. We also have a skull of a crocodile. This is going to help you build a cool dragon. Here's another page, computer-generated. Very cool. Look at all the textures in here. These are textures that you might want to put into your dragon. Again, look at the teeth, tongue. There's a pile of reference that you can source out here and apply to your dragon. Let's have a look down here. Very cool pattern and markings on this. Look at the plates. These all can be adapted into your dragon. This page is amazing. This artist has taken the same dinosaur and 3 times has changed the surface. This one has gone to a tiger stripe. This one's gone to a leopard pattern. This one's been based on an iguana. Now the iguana is a reptile that I use a lot in my dragons. I just love the surface. I love the pebbling. I think he's an amazing reference for a dragon. This is a cool computer-generated image. Note the surface, the texture, the reflections and the markings. This can easily be applied to your dragon. One of my best influences is reptile books. This is a beautiful photo that has amazing detail. Look at the reflections in the tongue. Look at the detail in the scales and the horns. This can be applied to your dragon. This guy is very cool. Look at his series of horns here. The texture and the surface and the reflection in these horns may influence some of the horns on my dragon. Okay, look at this cool little dude. I can take this and apply this to the surface of my dragon. These are what I call bubble scales. And they're just a random pattern of little pebbles. And that's how you'll have to paint them. But they're a lot of work. They're a lot of detail. But this could be the surface of your dragon. Take a look at this cool guy. Now this is what I call horn scales. It's a little bit of a step up from the bubble scales that we see down here. And look at how wet this texture is. It almost looks like brains, but very, very cool. Again, very cool horns. And look at the wrinkles in here. This guy's prehistoric. He's your dragon right there. Just put some teeth on him, change his format a little bit so he looks more like the typical dragon, and you got something that's very cool. Take away his stupid smile, to make him evil, but his surface is amazing reference. Now remember I said we've never seen a dragon before, but this is what we call a Komodo dragon. So man has actually labeled it as a dragon, and this is the closest we know to a dragon. But he's not very typical to the fantasy dragon that we know, and he doesn't look very evil, even though he's got a bad attitude in real life. Here we have one of the Komodo dragons, or 2 of them in action here, and I don't even know what they're mowing down on, but they got some attitude there. Let's have a look at this viper. He has a lot of dragon qualities. A lot of the Chinese dragons have this kind of feel to them when they get simplified. But take a look at the fangs and the reflection inside the mouth and the little horns. This can influence your dragon as well. Let's have a look at this character. He's called a thorny devil from Australia. Doesn't even look real, but look at all the horns and stuff. Now this may influence your dragon as well. This is crazy, but I mean, if you can't find something cool in nature that you can apply to your dragon, you're not really pushing your dragon. So what we have here is a dragon book. Now this was found in the kids section as well. Now dragon reference is kind of weak at times. Now this one here has really good texture to it. There's a lot of good surface quality in here, but the dragons are still kind of on the fluffy side. Let's have a look inside. Now, this is computer generated. There's lots of neat stuff, but the layout of some of the dragons, they're a little questionable. You got to analyze, is this dragon plausible? Do you think those wings could support a dragon that big? I have my doubts. Now, they say that you have to have a dragon with a big belly because they eat a lot of plants. This fuels the fire, so it creates methane so that it can breathe fire. Well, you put a big belly on a guy like this and you put big legs on a guy like this, he's going to need wings that stand out to here in my eyes in order to get him off the ground. This is like putting wings from a little biplane on top of a 747. It's not going to fly. So here's another guy. I like the surface of him. The texture is really dealt with, but the structure of him, he's very cut out in mass. He looks like he's made out of porcelain and can't move. Now, do you want to render something that looks like it can't move? Let's move on to the next one. This one is really cool. This is just a tail. You can see the fins. going back on the back of the tail into a spade. The colors are very inventive. This looks like he maybe got some influence off a fish or something. And the scales roll around, their perspective's cool. It's not a full dragon, but I would work from this reference. Look at this guy. I love some of the surface quality in here. Look at the design in here. Look at the texture. The computer is doing an amazing job, and the guy who's behind the computer has done an amazing job of creating cool veining and texture. Look at the highlights on the horns. Very, very mature. Yet you look at the whole piece, he still has a cartoon feel, and he doesn't, even though he's trying to get a serious look about him, it still has somewhat of a cartoon feel to it. Okay, have a look at this guy. You know, I'm not sure how believable this is. The wings look like they might be big enough to get him to fly, but they might not be strong enough. He's still very bulky, and you might not even want to put wings on your dragon. I'm wondering where his other horn is, unless that's just one in the middle. And the whole thing is just kind of hokey, but the texture and the handling of light is very well done. Well, I can see where the influence on this came from. Look back to our lizards. All these patterns in here, all the bubble ones, all the scaling. This guy has looked at nature in order to create this one. The teeth. This tooth is amazing. That is great. You know, it came off of someone's necklace, but I think it's really cool. Big nose hole. This guy's going to breathe a lot of fire. Although the colors are a little cheesy. I'm not sure if I'd want a pink dragon, and I'd have a hard time selling that to my client. But this is pretty cool. It's not as aggressive as I'd like to see him, but good reference nonetheless. This is a good example where the computer really stiffens up your reference. It looks so cut and masked out like we had cut it out of vinyl or something. And it's just, all the levels and layers don't fit together on this project. Although there is some cool reflection in here and some different lighting. I don't know. This dragon doesn't scare me too much. So we just looked through this dragon book. Some useful information in there. Take that and utilize it. There's also some stuff that isn't going to work. Identify it, discard it. Okay, now we've picked the references that I want to use. I'm going to utilize a little bit of this guy, a little bit of this guy, especially in the horns. I like the surface of this guy. I really enjoy the reflections in him. I like the texture in here, and then a little bit for this guy in the mouth. I also have a snake reference that I'm going to use for part of the texture on the body of our dragon. This is going to give us about 5 different ways to go about creating scales and surface on our dragon. So now, as good as this reference is, we have to consider something else. We have a copyright infringement issue if we copy it. Now, if you're taking someone else's reference that some artist has worked really hard on, you shouldn't be ripping it off and copying it. You're an artist. You should create new stuff. So just be influenced slightly by it. Take certain aspects of it if that's what you're going to do. But don't go taking someone else's image and just copy it. Now, if you had created the original and you see other people taking your stuff and utilizing it, then you're going to feel like you're infringed upon. This could lead to a lawsuit. It's not usually that likely, especially if you're doing one-ofs, but if you're mass producing stuff, this could be an issue. So strive to create your own stuff. Okay, look at how cool this tooth is on here. Now, with that copyright, I think we could lift this tooth and use it. You know, make it a little longer. There's not going to be any issue on that. It's going to be hard to identify. It's the whole image that's the problem. Quite often your client will bring you something from a cheesy romance novel with a dragon on it and say, I want that dragon. Then you have to talk him out of it a little bit, take the aspects of that dragon that he likes, and combine with some of your own consulting with the client so that you come up with a really cool new version. Now I'm preparing to start this project. I got my dragon in front of me. I've had to turn him on his side because I work better that way. Everything in a dragon tends to be really detailed. So your tight detail with your airbrush is imperative or you're going to fail at this. So you have to have good control before you take on a dragon, or you have to work at an extreme size. This is what I think is the best reference for me to do this head. I also have a prior project that's very similar to look from, and I have my original drawing for information I can't see on here. This is all I need around me for this portion of this project. In my shop, I would really like to spend 30 hours on this project. This project's just going to be portions and bits and pieces of different surfaces, not a complete project. So it's going to be like 5 dragons compiled into one. And since we're going to use 5 different scales on this dragon, pebbled, maybe horned, maybe fish scaled, this dragon is not going to be cohesive throughout. So there's no sense even taking this as a final project. This is an instructional project. Okay, my mixture is all in the AutoAir Detail 4200 series. I've got a mixture of black, yellow, and root beer together. And my mixture is a little bit on the cool side because I'm taking in and I'm dealing with my shadow areas. If I was directly with black right now, it would be too harsh. And I tend to save my whites. I pound my whites in and then I slowly chisel out all my details. Now I'm just creating some veining here, influenced by the iguana above me, and this is going to slowly work into shapes. Now my mixture is pretty loose. I've got it reduced quite a bit, so it's going to skate a little bit, and you just saw that happen in there. Not too worried about it. I can cover it up with white. I'm just creating a whole bunch of little tiny guys in there. Now doing this thing at this scale, all these little pebbles, is tedious and tough to do. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. I've been airbrushing a long time and known for my detail, but sometimes your brush can't do it, sometimes you can't do it, sometimes your paint won't react for you. And if this project was 50% smaller, getting that kind of detail may be next to impossible. So there are some other options, and I'm going to show you that right now. Now the fact that AutoAir is a water-based paint, there's lots of things that are compatible. This is a Pigma pen. It's a light fast ink. Unfortunately, it's black and it's going to be a little harsh, but I have used these in the past. You can go in there and start drawing them all like this. It does provide a little bit of a different look to your artwork because it's very bold. Color in the little areas in between the scales. Again, looking at your reference. Now these also come in different dimensions. You can get different tip sizes, you can get wedges to them. It'd be nice if you could control all the colors, like getting a sepia or a brown or even a yellow, but that doesn't seem to be an option with these pens. But once we've created all this cool little details and stuff, they're very flat and they look like a cartoon book. So you have to go in and chase them with the airbrush. Again, you have to prove your airbrush skills to get there. This is why dragons are so difficult to do, because the detail is incredible on them. So now I have the airbrush and I'm going to try to tone these out. Now this has also presented a new problem. I want the dragon reference to be in a different location so I can get the best angle on it. How am I going to create shadows on this? I have a light source from up here. That would be the top right hand corner. And now it's shining down on these little pebbles. These little pebbles are going to cast a shadow. So now I've got to go in there and I've got to try to get those to work. Now we're starting to get a little bit of dimension to these guys. But look at how tiny they are. You got to have everything working properly to get at this scale and this size. And that's not the easiest thing to do. So what are our solutions if you can't do it? You know, I guess you got to spend a couple more years to get better. Or maybe you have to change the skin tone. Maybe you have to go to something a little bit simpler to work with. There's also a few other devices you can use. You can hide things in shadows a little bit, but somewhere along the line you're going to have to really step up and try to create this detail. And that's the tough part about doing these dragons. That's why there isn't a lot of dragons out there that are done well by airbrush artists, because they're that difficult to pull off. Always check your tip, make sure it's clean. Tip buildup is a common problem with any paint that you have and any airbrush you have. You're not going to alleviate it, you just have to accept it. You reduce it down as much as you can so you can still spray it, and then just anytime you hear that noise change in your air, then like you'll hear a little wispy sort of noise instead of being smooth and fluid. That's a good indication that you're going to have tip buildup. If you leave that tip buildup too long, it's going to build up on the end and spit out on your project and leave a whole bunch of dots. So what I'm doing right now is just trying to do a transition between these two, the two different styles of outlining these scales. And it's never going to work totally. One transition would be grabbing the pen again and maybe perhaps just echoing a few of the lower sides into it. So you're gradually introducing it. So now I'm bringing in the Pigma pen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to unify these circles into the scales that I created over here. Now these little bubble scales that were free-handed have a softer feel than the ones that are done with the Pigma pen. So what I'm doing is I'm just introducing the Pigma pen into my handmade circles and just doing the bottom halves of them, just into the shadow areas, and gradually bring them into the ones that are fully outlined. This will unify the two of them, but once again, I think we have to go back in and try to freehand it out. Okay, so now I got the airbrush in here and I want to freehand these out. So I'm just taking the darkest areas and blending out from them. This is where you have to be right on top of the project. You have to be close. This is probably where the name is derived of cross-eyed. It's from working 13, 14-hour days working this close. You just heard the air change there? That means we're going to get buildup. The more you detail with your airbrush, the more tip buildup you're going to get. what you're doing is you're pushing very, very little paint through there, but you're pushing tons of air. And that paint is going to dry on the tip because the air is going to dry what minimal paint's going. If you keep your flow going, tip buildup is very minimal. But that's not possible when you're doing extreme detail. Do a clean out, key back in. When you get this close to your project, it's always good to take a little bit of time and back off from it and see how you're doing with it. See if it's believable. Now, even though my mixture is kind of a brownish yellow that's cooled off with black, if I build that up into my crack areas 2, 3, 4 times, just stay in that same area, it'll almost read black. Okay, I've bailed out on that color. I've changed my color to a little bit darker. I've added a little more black. This is going to allow me the ability to blend in with that pigment pen and soften it up a little bit. Kind of reposition myself a little bit too so I can get in tighter. So there's always an ideal way to approach your airbrush. Angle of approach, angle on the page, like is it going to be down like this, or are you going to be straight on? Are you going to thin it out more? Are you going to be on the right side, left side? Is your lighting correct? Are you casting a shadow on what you're doing? These are all things that I determine in my shop to find out what I'm going to get the best results from. Now I'm finding this mixture is working a lot better for me. My new positioning helps a little bit. Now I can be more successful than I was down here, which means I'm forced to go back in here and kind of clean up my mess a little bit. And the whole time I'm considering my lighting. Again, it's up from the top right, coming down. That's my primary light. So that means these horns, if they're overlapping, are going to cast a shadow. Again, as this cheekbone rolls around, that's going to cast a shadow as well. But I'm going to identify the detail first, then deal with my shadows. Not only are you dealing with shadows on each individual pebble, you're dealing with a shadow on the whole shape. Otherwise, this will just read flat. If it's squared off to me, these bubbles are going to be more opened, and as if they roll around, they get smaller. Let's go up and look at the iguana, and I'll show you. On this guy, we have these pebble scales. Now, where they're flat off, they're opened up. The ellipse is bigger and fatter. As he starts to roll around underneath his jaw, they become smaller and smaller. This is getting you the roll around underneath the jaw. Then the lighting from the top gets a little bit darker. See how light this one is compared to how dark these are. That's going to give you the tone for the whole overall shape. Yet there's still a shadow on each little pebble. So now I'm going to kind of phase out these guys a little bit just by noodling in some small ones that aren't totally done, and then bring in some cracking into them. This is just molding of skin and stuff. Just another way of treating it. You can go and do circles everywhere, but if you go and do circles everywhere, it tends to look really cartoony. I've seen tons of reference, and there's probably reference in that dragon book where there's just pebble scales everywhere. There's no diversity to it. A lot of artists will do that, but it looks really amateur. It looks like wallpaper by the time you're done. As I roll around below the cheek, I'm being conscious that I should make these ones a little bit narrower. Like tighten up my ellipses on each little pebble scale. If you don't approach your dragon kind of with this meticulous effort, chances are your dragon isn't going to have any detail to it at all, and it's going to look kind of hokey, and it's going to look kind of cheesy, and it's going to lack information. It's going to be sloppy. And keep in mind, this dragon is fairly big for how I have to work normally. Normally I have to work a lot smaller than this. I'm going to pull in my positive stencil and lay this down. And what this is going to do is I'm just going to validate the shadow on his shoulder a little bit more. That'll make that cheek pop out a bit more for me. Let it drop off. Now that edge shows up a little bit more. Now I'm going to change colors and create a shadow in here. Okay, I've changed my mixture now, and my mixture has been warmed up. A lot more yellow in it, a little bit of red, and more root beer. All I did was add to my existing mixture. That's only because I want to warm it up. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't use purple in here. You could use any color you want. You could paint all these guys in green. You know, don't be taking notes right now and saying, oh, he didn't give me the right mixture and stuff like that. This is where you're the wizard. You're the one creating the colors that you want to use on your dragon, because it's fantasy. There is no right answer here. Now I'm tinting everything out a little bit and pounding into the cracks between the scales. What this is going to do is it's going to unify it all together. It's going to kind of marry all those dark areas a little bit with all the light areas. So I'm working just about every portion of this project right now with this color. creating a fairly dramatic shadow from this horned ridge that's above. Now this side I'm going to go a little bit heavier on and roll it around the side. This is going to give me shape and form to the whole cheek. Usually under the eye too. The eyelids tend to have a little bit of dimension and maybe cast a shadow underneath it. Just moving around the project while I got a color going here. Got a bit of a groove going. Just molding out. Now this is getting into a little bit of a bone texture as I get into here because I've cut out this nasal cavity to look like it's bone. So I'm going to treat the front a little bit more bone-like. So there's going to be a morphing. And this is part of showing you different textures or different surface treatment to our dragon. The same color works good as a mid-tone between the gums and the teeth. Now the gums aren't wet and juicy because if I did that it wouldn't look like bone. Note that I'm spraying with air all the time. If you go on and off the air all the time, it tends to disrupt your flow and it's going to cost you time and efficiency. So try to get into the habit, if you can, of spraying with the air on all the time when you're doing freehand work like this. Even though it's masked up on the outside, I still consider this freehanding. I just step back a little bit, a couple feet, to have a look at and identify problem areas and how much I should push this. Keep in mind this whole inner cavity and cavern inside of here, if we're going to make this cheekbone step out and the jaw fall in behind, it's going to have to be darker underneath. Also running some color into the teeth, give them some dimension. The color I have is really cool right now, and the fact that if I spray a little bit of it, it goes yellow. If I saturate it, it gets a little bit warmer. And if I really saturate it and pound it on like 4 or 5 times the same place, it actually goes really dark. So I'm getting real bang for my buck. I can get kind of 3 colors out of 1, just depending on how I apply it. Okay, what I've done is mixed up a white mixture now, quite reduced with the 4011, and I'm just going to revalidate my highlights. I'm looking at my iguana reference, and I'm just taking some of those highlights off of there. Looking to where the reference reflects off of each scale and each pebble. Creating little ridges and movements. I'm having to move my eye too far to see my reference. If I have it closer, then I don't have to move my head, I can just move my eyes. And if I'm going to look at that reference 5-6 times every 20 seconds, that's important. I know that there's little cracks around this sort of bone area. So on the edge, I'm putting highlights on it. And look at some of these pebbles. Start putting some highlights in those. I'm just rocking the airbrush, keeping the flow going. A lot of times I test it on big areas. So easy for the paint to build up at this point. And it doesn't matter if it's solvent or water-based, they all build up. Now again, there's a couple ways of doing this. In my shop, quite often I'll carry a 000 brush. And I can dab it in, and this is the beauty of a water-based paint. Mix it up and just put a little dabs in there and chase it out. Now the problem with using a paintbrush, most artists will go in too bold. And he won't marry the paintbrush to the airbrush or the airbrush to the paintbrush. And it stands out bold. I think you've seen this on pinups, where you have a face and the artist is gone, and it's airbrushed really soft. And since he can't get the detail of eyelashes, he's gone in and painted the pupil and the eyelashes with a black paintbrush, and it stands out like a hole. It doesn't even look like it's on the same character. The airbrushing is not marrying together with the paintbrush. You have to have the two look cohesive together if you're going to use the two together. Okay, I've slid down the panel a little bit to get a little bit better angle. I'm also resting my hand on the project, or on my reference that's taped to the project. This is giving me a guide where I can pendulum my airbrush on. Gives me kind of a pivot point to rock back and forth on. This will steady out my stroke. I'm on a fairly sharp angle. This way I can keep building it up. Still identifying little highlights here. Looking at my reference. Keeping that tip clean is very important. With tip buildup, you're going to have to experiment with air pressures, and to get detail with air pressures, Different paint mixtures may require different pressures. I like to spray between about 18 and 35 pounds, depending on what I'm trying to achieve. Now, if we want to make this guy really wet, then what we do is we overemphasize the highlights. That means get them super bright. Just working some of the structure for the roots on the teeth. Don't need to go too far in here because of the shadows. Maybe just a slight highlight and a sheen. Let it disappear. Yeah, that looks pretty good in there. So now that's just one little area. This is just an area of little pebbles where we've detailed it and punched it up. It's high concentration. You can't focus on anything else but it and keep working it. Now I'm going to pull out some teeth reference and deal with the teeth and the horns on this side. I've gone to a little bit of a greener tone, and that reference from the computer below me is influencing this tooth. There's a lot of green in it, so I'm going to use green in this one. It's a pretty cool reference. Keep in mind this is the shadow side of my dragon, so I'm going to have to pound a lot more color on this side than I would on the other side. I'm set up so I can pull long, straight, even strokes, and I'm going over the same area 4, 5, 6 times just so I can control how much quantity of paint I put on. Trying to save my white highlights a little bit. Got little barbs on the teeth here, just throwing a little shadow on it. I'm also going to have to go back in with my stencil and knock back the backgrounds because I had a double registration here. Didn't quite take my time enough there, so I've created a mistake that I have to fix now. I'm only going to do the next 2 teeth. Just kind of do half of this guy. Now all I'm doing is creating little sort of cylinders and little daggers right now. But the detail on this computer stuff is pretty cool. They've put in some little textures in there and added to it, almost like there's some staining. And it's in a little bit different color, so I'm going to drop a brown and maybe a drop of black into my mixture to deal with that in a second. And meanwhile, we'll have a different tone going. I'm just going to tint out into the bone a little bit, into the shadow areas, because this is a little cooler color. It's going to make a good shadow. Okay, I think it's time to go to that other color. Okay, I've got that mixture in where I added a bit of brown and added a little bit of black to it. I can chisel out between my teeth a little bit more now. And again, this could be any mixture you want. Your reference might tell you to go purple. Your instinct might tell you to go pink with it. That's your choice on your dragon. I think if you go pink, I don't think your dragon's going to be that cool. But that's your preference and your choice. Got a good color in here. I'm just chasing it around. This is creating a little shadow between the teeth and giving me some perspective so that they roll back around his jaw. Again, 4 or 5 passes, and all of a sudden you have some saturation to it. Now I'm going to deal with some of that marbling that are in the teeth. This is going to look great. Just getting this modeling and marbling into the tooth so it looks like it's a chunk of marble. And then you just highlight over top of it afterwards. It's going to come alive. Put a little more marbling into these teeth. Maybe some little fractures. This is where you add the cool factor to a project, just by giving them some believability. I might even give them some scars and cracking into the bone part of them. It's just going to look that much rougher, that much more modeled. It's going to imply that you put that much more detail in it. In actuality, you have put a lot more detail into it, but some of it's just implied as well. There's a little bit of a lip above his gums where the teeth attach to your roots. I'm just going to build that up a little bit, keeping in mind where my primary light source is. Basically, what I'm doing right now is I'm thinking out loud with you, showing you where my mind goes as I'm working on a project. I know that a lot of guys, that I've taught before or worked with me and stuff, they're thinking about the movie they're going to watch that night while they're doing this. And quite often, that's when the big mistakes really happen. Now, I know these teeth in the back side, especially from about this one back, they're going to be in the shadow a little bit more. So I'm going to emphasize that a little bit more. Working in one area is usually a little bit tedious. Some guys like to start in one top corner and work their way all the way down. There's nothing wrong with that, and get everything done as they go. I roll around my project all the time. I work the whole thing at once. So I could be working on this guy right now, and since this color's in here, I should be working on, say, down here, because these are going to be the same material. And then I might be up on the horn, and then I might be down to the other finger. This is how I roll in my shop, but it's going to be tough for you guys to keep up if you do it that way on the DVD. But I mean, this is efficient now because that color's in there, and if I'm going to use it on all the teeth and the horns and all the claws, I should work them all together. It makes sense to. Okay, so now I'm on to the horn, and I think I'm going to do this more or less the same material too. Now, horns and antlers and stuff are great reference for this. You might be taking your reference from a gazelle or a bighorn sheep. Why not have that information around to support you? All it's going to do is give you more credibility in your end result. Less information you have to invent yourself, the easier it's going to be. But it does take time to get this reference together. Okay, I've tilted this up so I can get a better angle of approach on this line. I'm constantly moving my project around, walking around it, turning it upside down, inside out, putting it on my lap, on the workbench, on a jig, whatever works best for my angles. Now I'm just creating form and shape here, and now I'm introducing a little bit of that modeling that I liked in the teeth. This will just give it a little bit of a marble look. It'll make our dragon look like he's pretty expensive. Still not trying to lose too much of my highlight. You lose too many of your highlights, then you're starting again. You want to lose just enough so that when you do go back in with your white, or all your highlights are the reflection parts of it. After I get this color done, I'm looking at it and thinking, it'd be nice to introduce a little bit of a lighter yellow color. So I'm probably going to mix that up here right after this. Now, of course, in my shop, I'd stay in this color for probably the next half an hour and address all the teeth, all the horns, and all the claws. That way I don't have to memorize this mixture. I just get it done, and then I'm on to the next color. If I have to mix this color 4 or 5 times, it's going to be very inefficient. While I got this color in here, I'm just going to poke an eye into it. Nice little beady one just pointing at you. Something you have to be forced to stare down. Look back. I'm always bobbing my head back. Bigger projects, I get back and look at them from 10 feet away, study them. Some of the stuff you can't see until you step away from it. Throwing your project in front of a mirror is always good advice too, because you'll see stuff on a reversed angle that you can't seem to see when it's right in front of you on the right plane. Just reversing it or flipping it upside down is another option too. You look at things a little different because you don't know what the image looks like upside down as much as you do straight up, and you'll see problems in your artwork that way. I've mixed up a little more yellow in this, and I've really reduced it with the 4011 reducer. And this is just going to be a process of tinting and a little bit dealing with that marbling. Very, very subtle stuff here. This airbrushing game is all about patience. You don't have any patience, it all falls apart for you and you end up leaving stuff that is very inferior quality. I'm just slowly tinting it out. You can see that yellow starting to come into it. Now I don't want to lose those white highlights. Just enough so that when I go back in with my white, these highlights make some sense. I'm just chasing this down to the teeth now and tinting those down too while I have them. Want them to match, got the color mixed up. Again, in your shop, you're doing this project to be efficient. You would probably be doing everything that's this material throughout the whole dragon. So now I've gone to white, and what I'm doing is just punch in my highlights now. Give this guy some shine. I'm leaning against my project a little bit. That's just to steady my hand. Multiple passes over top of it. Picking out the highest spots to create my highlight. That's important. If you get it on a low spot, like an underneath, it won't make any sense of where you put the highlight. So really identify where your highlight's going to go. I'm stepping back, having a look. It's starting to look like ivory. I'm kind of liking that. Since I have the white in there, I'm going to dress the eye a little bit. Play around with it a little bit, have some fun. There, have a look at that. That's starting to give us some shine and some luster. Now I'm going to identify the highlights on the teeth. Very slow build up here. You want it really shiny, make these things a little brighter. Now you can also take the auto air and work it on a palette with a little 000 brush and stroke in these highlights and dissipate them out. But make sure you thin it out with the 4011. And even the 4010 reducer is quite nice to work with that because it seems to have an extender quality to it. With the 4010 reducer, it'll take a lot longer to dry, but it gives you some control and you can move it around almost like when you're oil painting. Okay, I've gone back in with that yellow mixture. It's cooled off a little bit by having the previous sort of greenish brown in there. And what this is going to do is just tint out my highlight just a little bit. It gives me a little bit more control. White is always more difficult usually to spray than any other color. And if you leave white in there, it creates a little bit of overspray. It doesn't look quite as natural having the overspray in there as it does going in and tinting it out afterwards. What you're doing is just getting rid of that random loose overspray. It looks a little more natural. Creates a more natural luminosity. Okay, we're up to the horn, and same thing. Just chasing it out a little bit. A lot of multitude of reflections going on in here, and they're very diffused reflections, meaning they're not super bright. Ivory kind of has this translucency to it, and that's what we're kind of emulating here a little bit. Also creating a little more marbling into it as I go. A little bit of shadow onto the bottom side. Seems like you can go through a whole pile of detail in it, and then go back and throw more in, then go back and throw more in. It's almost endless. This head can take me, I can spend 20 hours on this head if I want to now. It may not be feasible to do that. Spend that long might put you out of business too. So it's a tap dance between how far you go with the detail and how good a quote you can get to allow you to work that long on it. Just throwing some shadow in the eye here. There we go. Okay, so now we have this tooth here. I'm looking at the detail on that, looking at the detail on this. This could be pushed even a little bit further, meaning I'd probably introduce a paintbrush now just to validate those highlights a little brighter. But I usually do that at the very end after I've got the whole project done. So now I'm going to identify another section of this and try a different type of scale to educate you in something else. So remember these great references that we found earlier? I love this dinosaur one. I love the texture on it. I'm going to take it over and add it to this project. Now this is his shoulder blade going back with his forearm and his hand coming out at an extreme perspective. I'm going to paint this back shoulder blade and bicep and a little bit of the tricep in the background in this texture here. So now what I've taken is my yellow mixture and I've gone in and added some black to it. And all I'm going to do is just add wrinkles. Now this is tight chiseling, and it takes a while to get good at this. Now where you put these patterns is all determined on, where do you think these wrinkles are going to come from? How are they going to stretch? Are they going to be elongated? I'm looking at this dinosaur, and he's put a lot of the wrinkles in elongated along the leg, with the short ones going sideways. So I'm going to emulate that as well. It's just all where the skin will stretch. Now, I'm not an expert in this. All I'm going to do is just study it as an artist would and see if that's the smartest way to go about it. Chiseling out the top of this finger, making these wrinkles roll around the shape. It's going to make that arm look like it rolls around as well. Now, these are simple things that you're dealing with perspective. But if you don't understand the perspective part of it, then you're going to create something inferior to that, and it's not going to make a lot of sense when you're done at the end of the day. Or if you spend 3 or 4 days on it, it's still not going to make any sense. Getting an elephant out isn't a bad idea. I'm pretty sure the artist that rendered this had a little look at an elephant before he did it. Okay, I've done crisscrossing all my little wrinkles in here. And now I've gone in with I've got a mixture of root beer and yellow together. And what I want to do is kind of splotch some of these patterns that I'm seeing in there. It's almost like camouflage, really. So I'm just going to create some inconsistent shapes. Again, when they're rolling around the top, let's treat them a little bit differently than when they're in the middle. When they're in the middle, we can go a little bit fatter with them. We'll go a little bit thinner when they roll around the bottom. This will create the illusion that this thing has a shape and a form that rolls around. Have my mixture very thin so I can control it, and you can still see what's underneath it. If we went with a semi-opaque paint right now, we'd end up losing both our highlights and we would lose quite possibly our cracking that we put underneath. And since I'm not going to do this anywhere else on the project, this is just going to be another surface that we're identifying. I'm not going to keep this color. I'm going to mix a new one and create another pattern in there. Okay, what I've got now is a green tone in here, very subtle. I'm going to do the same thing with this. Again, this is really reminding me of camouflage. Sort of random shapes that sort of connect in stripes. I'm going a little darker towards the bottom. because of my top light source. And then I'll introduce a third color into there. Okay, I've brought in a third color, which is more of a root beer with a little bit of black in it, just to cool it off so it's a little more chocolate. And it's still pretty warm, but I'm kind of liking it. And this is going to complete my third color in here. And I'm just basing it solely on this rendering of the dinosaur, which he might have based on the pattern of a wild cat and maybe the texture of an elephant, and then created some of his own stuff on there. There's nothing saying you can't get an animal book and be influenced by the same things. You just have to be creative enough to adapt it to a new place. It's all about being innovative. And it's not that I'm being particularly innovative with what I'm doing right now, but what I am doing is I'm showing you a way to look that way and a way to think that way. And that's what's really important for you to take out of this DVD. Stepping back, having a look at it, adding a few things while I have the opportunity. Then we have to throw some reflection lines into this. So this makes a little bit of sense. I'm going to change that color and go to my white. Okay, I have some white in here. Now I'm just going to identify some reflections in it. Try to keep these fairly sharp, because they are highlight reflections. They're very sharp in my reference, so I'm going to try to emulate that a little bit. Now my light source is on the top. It's quite common occurrence that the reflections are going to hit the top. To put the reflections way down on the bottom isn't going to make a lot of sense for me. All this is going to do is just make this guy wet and bubbly. It's going to give each one of these little grooves and notches a highlight on top of it so they stand out. Now this isn't the only way to go about this. I'm only going to do part of it this way, and I'm going to show you a different technique here that you might want to utilize in your shop. That's using the paintbrush on this. So now what I've done is I've grabbed my dark mixture with a paintbrush. I flip it 180 to get a nice little wedge on it. And then I just go in and I throw some of my cracks and fusions in here with the paintbrush. Now these are more crisp and more detailed. This will work especially if you're doing extreme perspective. The stuff that's really close to you, maybe throw in with a paintbrush. The stuff that's a little further away from the viewer's eye and you want to diffuse into the background, maybe do with the airbrush. This again can be revalidated by chasing it with the airbrush so it blends in. A lot of airbrushers wouldn't go this far, but it doesn't mean that this isn't faster and give you a better result. I kind of look at it as my trade is that an airbrush is just a tool. You may use it 80% of the time, but there's other things in your toolbox that you can use to get the results, sometimes faster, but definitely making it better. You don't want this as prominent, you mix your mixture a little lighter, or you thin it out a little bit more so it's not as potent. But this is giving me some really crisp lines in there, as opposed to what the airbrush was doing. It's not quite as crisp. Or you can take more time and go a little more crisper with it, thinning out your mixture and being a little more tighter. So now I'll clean this out and go to white. Okay, the nice part about having this all masked off is I can do all my experiments just off the project and then go back on. I have a diluted white in here. What I'm going to do is just chase the bottom. Looking at my reference, I'm just going to follow the bottom edge of each one of these big cracks a little bit. Just throwing a little highlight in there, chasing it around, giving myself the appearance that this is very textured. Emulate a lot of the shapes you're seeing in your reference. They're very haphazard in a way. They're not all the same. If you create them all the same, you're going to create wallpaper effect to your surface. This is where being kind of random and very methodical about looking at your reference is going to help you. The thinner this mixture gets, the further I pull it down. It's not as bright, but it's still giving me the dimension as I go through it. Look at that effect. That's beautiful. Look at how quick this is too compared to working with the airbrush. But it's going to take a while to get the knack of how much to put on and how much not to. Otherwise it stands out like a sore thumb. Now if I want some really bright highlights and the really intense reflections like I'm seeing on my reference, I'd probably put those on my highest side, where I think that light is going to hit it the sharpest and the brightest. Alright, that's looking very cool. Now let's chase that out with the airbrush so it's not so obvious in there. Okay, I have a darker mixture in here. And all I'm doing is just going to tint this out a little bit. And what I mean by tinting out, I'm chasing my dark areas and just diffusing them a little bit so they're not quite as solid in this, and you don't see the brush stroke quite as much. By the time I'm done this, it's hard to determine if I used a brush or used an airbrush. And that's probably a good thing. That means you've married the two tools together to create an effect without being able to tell how it was done. If it's really bold and stands out, it's just going to look like pinstriping on a flame. Very bold and blunt. This here, we're trying to create something that's very flawless. I'm also doing little tints on each one of these little shapes on the lower edge, and that's going to create a little bit of dimension to them. Again, this is very subtle. Blending into the shadows, creating a fairly solid shadow. It's going to be kind of dramatic lighting. There we go. Yeah, that's looking good. And then for one last little touch, I'll put a little bit of yellow in here and tint the whole thing. Okay, now I've got a really diluted yellow in there. Very diluted. I'm going to work those warm spots again first. This will blend up to my highlights. And try not to go directly on my highlight. This again will marry everything together a little bit more. And then tint the whole thing just slightly. That'll bring down your highlights a little bit and unify it all onto one surface. While I have that color in here, I'm just going to tint out my pebble scales a little bit, especially on the shadow side. Tint them over the teeth a little bit. This will bring everything together. Okay, I'm looking at some other types of scales here. Now these are very common to put onto a dragon. A lot of the fantasy artists will do their scales this way. These are overlapping plates. They allow flexibility and movement, yet they give it strength and protection. Usually the weakest part of a dragon is supposedly the belly surface. These aren't quite as strong as the horns and plates that are on the back of the dragon. I call this like a breastplate, and this is quite often put on the underside of the dragon. They overlap so that they can move, but they are made out of tough material, sort of like armor plating. When you adapt this to your dragon's torso and through the belly plate, make sure you get the perspective right on each arc so that it curves around. What I'm doing here is adapting these overlapping scales into the breastplate. I have a pencil drawing underneath, but I'm just drawing them in a little tighter in black so you can have a look. Now, I've got to adapt what I'm doing here into the dragon. So now these guys got to get drawn in here. If I got to freehand this, there's a good chance of me messing it up. So I'm going to go in with the chalk pencil and just draw it in nice and light. Got that in my hand. I'm looking at my reference right now. Now this is rolling around towards me, so more of them are going to be in quite tight. As it starts to square off, they open up and get a little bit larger. This will give you the illusion that this has perspective and it's coming towards me. Everything you're doing is trying to fool the viewer's eye. It's almost like you're a magician. Now I'm not going to go real far with these because this is just one solution. So if I can just render this area, you could do the whole dragon that way. Okay, I've got a darker line which is going to emulate my shadow. I'm going to give this a little wipe so I can just barely see those before I chase them. Now this is where you have to be very smooth. Quite often, I'll go and guide it a few times like you just saw before I introduce paint. It gives you kind of a muscle memory. And if you can get that rhythm going, then you can pull some very smooth lines. I want the line to be sharper on the top, a little more diffused to the bottom, so I'm angling down slightly. It's easier to chase an existing line, so I'm going in with a very thin color right now. This will be validated with a darker line later. So now if I screwed up one of these and messed it up, it's not a big deal because I have very thin color on here and it's very light. If I'd chased this all with black and outlined it, it would take me twice as long to get rid of it. With that same color, now I'm going to throw a little bit of tone into them. This is just going to give it some dimension. Since this is a big area, it can go fast. Tip build up should be next to nothing. And I think I want this a little bit warmer to stand out. So this will just be my shadow, and then I'll chase it in with some warmer colors. Chisel up these lines a little darker. Keep in mind, I'm really thinking right now about where my highlights are going to be and how my light is going to hit it from my top primary lighting source, which is up above his shoulder up here, coming down this way. So most of the stuff's going to be in the shadows. As it gets down the belly, it's going to probably pick up a little bit more. Now, it wouldn't be a bad idea to grab my stencil now, and I can lay it in and throw that shadow in there. I've grabbed my positive. I'm trying to register them in here, and then I'm just going to tint out my shadow. And pull them off. Okay, I've gone to a warmer color now. Yellow with a little bit of red in it to create a bit of an orange. It's very, very subtle. I just want this breast pad to be a little bit warmer. Blending into my shadow. Now if I do little curl arounds here, what it's going to indicate is this comes out and juts out before it rolls around. Now I'm tinting the top just slightly, and especially in the shadow areas, getting rid of a lot of it. Now I'm going to have to change colors, go a little darker, and make those cracks and the little seams in between the plates more obvious. I have my darker mixture now. I'm just going to go in and try to validate these lines. Now this is going to give me my separation between the plates. I'm just curving them around into the seam. What this is going to do is give it just a little bit of a molding look. Depending on how you curve these arcs is going to dictate how your shape looks. Using that same dark mixture into the shadows and pushing it a little bit further. Sometimes you have to validate these lines 3-4 times to build them up to the depth that you like. But starting with a lighter mixture and controlling it prevents you having to go back in and cover it up with white. I like to take my time in this situation and build it up slowly so I have control as opposed to going in too heavy at first and destroying it all. A few little areas need to be a little bit darker in my eyes, especially where the shadows are going to hit it. And then I'm going to warm it up with a little bit warmer color. Okay, I have my warmer color in there now. Oh yeah, I like that color. That's good. Just leaving a little bit of tone on the bottom part of that so it looks like it rolls around. These are flattened out a little bit. I'm just giving them a little bit of a bubble look to them. I guess the Japanese or the Chinese dragons, they tend to have these breastplates on them built this way. Now I'm putting a little bit of scaling down this way. This is just going to give it a little bit of almost like a tension or a modeling look, like there's some structure within that plate. Being very subtle about those too. Keep in mind the curvature. Roll your brush around with the curvature of each one. Now the shapes that you might create in your dragon might be totally different. So you're going to have to analyze how you want it to move and what it's going to do when it does move. And then you're going to have to adapt your brush strokes so that they do work for you. So I put white in here, and now I want to put some highlights in. Now I'm just trying to make this look shiny. Playing off each one of those plates. Giving it a bit of a lip. And I'm going to put less and less as I get up to the top because it's going to be hidden into the shadows. Inversely, it's going to be a little more aggressive when I get down to the bottom. Now, the more you want this to bubble, the more you put a highlight right in the middle. The less you want this, if you want it to read more flat, then continue your highlights down further. You'd put less emphasis on this shadow. Whenever I get detail going, I tend to freeze up and get a little quiet because, you know, that's where you're using a lot of concentration at that time. It's a little tough to chew gum and walk at the same time sometimes. If you start ad-libbing stuff like I'm doing right now, it takes a little bit more work for you. I'm going to go back to that warm color again, and I'm going to play off those highlights. Making sure I put my dark highlights just on one side of them so that the highlight makes a little bit of sense. And this is just creating a little bit of texture and wrinkling into it. Sort of like maybe like a turtle or a tortoise shell, or perhaps, you know, scaling on a hard exoskeleton of a lizard of some sort. I'm stepping back and having a look at this. Now this is a point where you can introduce a paintbrush again. Got my paintbrush here with some highlights in it. Now if you want these highlights really bright, you can really push them in there. Now if these are too bold for you, it's quite simple. Just thin out your mixture. I'll do that right now. I'm just mixing in the cup of my airbrush right now because it's convenient. Now it's thinner. Now working with the auto air, when you're thinning it out, it tends to drag transparent and leaves a little ball right on the end. Try to pull away from it and pop up out of it. If you can do that, sometimes that ball will disappear. Now if I want a little sharp, crisper edge on this thing, just chase each one. You tend to use a lot of brushwork in dragons just because it's painful to do that much airbrushing that tight. It takes too long. And this is a little faster method quite often to create the texture you need. And you can get more detail into your project. And it's not cheating at all. The whole idea is just to make your project look good. There we go, that's looking pretty good. We can also do the same thing with darks if we needed to. But this gives you an idea of one way of approaching a belly pad on it. Now you have a lot of options to do this breast pad or the belly pad in here. You can paint this a multitude of ways. Any type of color, any material. You could make this chrome, you could make it gold plated, you could make it exactly like your reference here. You could go in and put a whole bunch of little dot patterns. Like I say, it's your dragon, build it your way. Take a look at this. This is a common scale for a dragon. A lot of the fantasy artists will do this sort of fish scaling, but it's like a grid and it wraps around. Look at the arc. Both ways, they curve around. They get tighter as this goes into the distance. They get closer together. Then they open up again. This is something you have to study as an artist to figure out how things are going to move and roll around. We're going to do a little bit down on our project. I've mapped out a little bit of a white grid. It didn't hurt me to put it in white, because I'm just going to chase it with the dark. Now you got to roll it around both sides. Now this is a tough method. You're going to have to map it in 3-4 times, then chase it out to smooth it out. Now I'm going really quick with this. Just trying to lay it in so you can see what this is about. Both ways. You'll find this is one of the most tedious things in the world. My patience level for this, especially during filming, is next to nothing. I'm just chasing my outer line here. Now that's a simple grid. Lines are going to get thicker as it gets closer to the viewer, thinner as it gets away from you. So I'll chase these ones that are closer to the eye, make them a bit heavier, they'll stand out more. Now just by changing the way these curve and roll, you can see the body kind of twist and roll around. Now if we take a look at our reference, you have that grid, but it doesn't come to complete X's. They actually roll around. They don't intersect crisscross. So if you want a scale like this, then you've got to paint each one individually. So we'll do a few and you'll see it. So what I'm doing now is just kind of rounding off my edges a little bit. Going in and chiseling them out a little bit. And what this is going to do is it's going to give me the impression that we have a little bit of a scale happening as opposed to just a grid pattern. Now I was going to mention a little bit about putting on a stencil here that shows the grid. But that grid isn't going to be accurate. Like you put a fishnet stocking on there, you're not going to get it to roll around and foreshorten. So you're relegated to just doing it longhand like I'm doing right now, which is very time consuming. The bolder this can be right now, the easier for you to see, but then it doesn't create very much detail. You're going to want to tone it like it has a bit of a shadow. So if you tone each corner with a slight shadow, now you can pick any color for these scales. You can even put a pattern into it. Like look at a Diamondback Rattler, it has 2 or 3 different tones in there. You pick the tones that you want and the patterns and the markings on it, and all of a sudden you have something different again. Sometimes I'll do one row of them. Sometimes they have a structure to them. So almost like a scale in the middle where they taper and then they blend out in a pattern almost like what a leaf would look like. If you add something like that, they just look like they have little crowns and ridges to them, in which case you have to identify how the light hits it. Nature offers so many different options when it comes to scales. All you have to do is look at a multitude of snakes and you're going to find different patterns, different textures, and each one's going to look a little bit different. So identify those. We can render this, but for the purpose of this DVD, all you need to know is this is an option. So we're going to just cut this short and go to another pattern. What I'm doing here is I'm just going in and doing some tighter ones now. What this is going to do is it's going to create the illusion that there's a reflection on that edge. This is more painterly as opposed to being more formulated like we did below. Already you can see a little bit of difference with this. There is no right answer to this. There's so many snakes out there and so many different possibilities of how to pull this off. You're just going to have to pick one that you like and be influenced by it. Now if I shadow this a little bit and then change some colors, go back in with white, maybe I chisel out a few of these a little bit. You can put some markings in them. You can try to change your markings a little bit. This is creating this one, and this one, and this one could be a different color than the rest of them. That's going to give you some more markings. This is all going to create diversity to your dragon. And it's tough to explore all the options with you right now, because we could go on forever on this. Every dragon that's been created now, there's going to be a new one next week. Every dragon you take is probably going to be different because you're going to be influenced by something else in your research. I'm just going to lightly go through this area here, and then I'm just going to hit it with a highlight. You can see how the reflection comes out on it. Chase them both ways. Then I'll go to white. What I'm just going to do is throw a little reflection in here. Look at how that brings out some shine and luster to this guy. Nice sharp line, and then diffuse it out to either side. All it did is just make his flesh tone, and we'll give him the outer lighting here, just a little reflection to the outside. It's making it look nice and slick, sort of like a black mamba. Let's move on to the claw. Now, we're not going to have time to do all the fingers here, so we're just going to do this one. I'm going to identify the middle one, and I'm just going to start putting in some texture and some tones. Sort of identify where my shadows are. This one I'm just going to kind of wing. I'm going to give them some textures, some bubbles, a bunch of things, just to try to create an interesting... Now this is freewheeling based on what I've seen. This will make things a lot faster for me, because sometimes I feel like I'm more competent, making stuff out of my head. At least I'm more efficient anyways. Now I know there's wrinkles in fingers, and there's going to be structures and tendons, and this is where I'm taking that experience from. Now dragons all have different approaches, like feet, they say they only have 4 toes and one opposable one at the back heel. This is common for dragons. Now with hands, some say they have 3 fingers, some say they have 4 fingers. I guess that depends if you do a human one. There's also what they consider sea creature dragons, and of course they'd have to be webbed between their claws. Some say they have anemic little hands, and these are used for agility because, if you listen to all the folklore and all the mythology on it and you followed it, all you would end up doing is contradicting yourself over and over again. I've read books on dragons that contradict themselves the next page. So I think a lot of the mythology behind dragons is a bunch of bunk, and you got to take it with a grain of salt. If someone tells you, only dragons do this or only dragons do that, you could probably go find a dragon book that contradicts them. But I'm looking at this guy, and a lot of things we haven't talked about now is the pose. What is this pose going to be? If you do a dragon, and every dragon you do is sitting down, he's going to be a pretty lazy dragon. That's what you're going to portray. If your pose shows him sleeping all the time, well then he's not going to be very vicious. So now if you're looking for a vicious dragon, you best not show him sleeping all the time. So the pose is actually more important than the texture that we've been dealing with. So let's deal with that a little bit. Let's pan back and have a look at this. Now, we have a pose where this hand is coming out at you. It's threatening. It's coming at you with big claws. These claws can rip you open. Now, if I gave him a little anemic hand so he can eat plants and stuff, so he can create methane, so he can breathe fire, how imposing is that? Although if he was breathing fire coming shooting out at us right now, maybe he's more imposing than he is right now. If we gave him longer fangs, would he be more evil? Perhaps he would. What if his horns were twice as long? What if his eyes were red? What if we put a chrome plate on him? If we battered him up, does that mean he's tough or does that mean he's weaker because he got beat up? These are things that you can determine on your own. The best artists tend to be very, very thorough in their thought process on how they go about this guy. And back in here, I've mixed up a little darker mixture. Just want to validate some of the things I've been doing on it and chisel out things a little bit more. It's looking pretty random the way I'm going about this, and if it looks that way, it's probably because it's kind of true. I'm just carving it up, doing some interesting things, and I'm pulling from my experience because I've painted a lot of different things that have texture. But I'm using the same principles of all the textures that we have given you before. This has a little bit of the shoulder in it, has a little bit of the pebble scales in it. It doesn't have any of the fish scales in it yet. I think I might avoid that in a hand. Although some guys will put them like this. They'll do a whole bunch of them right down the middle, like this. So now we have fish scales in there. And I don't think that really took away from it much. Although I don't tend to like them too much. It almost looks like an alien hand, somewhat. I guess if you did enough of this, you could verge it on biomechanical, which may make your dragon even cooler again. When I have a dragon project coming up and I quote on it, I make sure that I'm getting a little extra for it over a lot of other images because I know it's going to eat the clock up. Now if we just tint this with one color, just a light yellow with a little bit of root beer in it, very diluted, and then go back in with white highlights, this thing's going to scream. So that's what we'll do right now. I have my tint color in. I'm going to shadow out my darker areas a little bit, slowly bring them into my highlights. Trying to save my highlights. Going to do a little bit of modeling with it. It's almost like veining. Got a really good brush pattern going right now. Look at the detail in that. There we go. And then just give it a little bit of a tint. For two colors that are very close to each other, this is looking pretty sharp right now. Looks like a lot of detail in there. Okay, I have my white mixed up right now. Tested the mixture. It's very thin and translucent. This is going to give me a lot of luster and a lot of, almost like you can see through the skin, almost a translucency to it. If I approach it in a correct way, this thing is going to look almost like a salamander or something. You know how you can kind of see through the skin a little bit? That's what I'm trying for. Or almost like looking at brains or something. My highlights are fairly random. Sometimes they pick up 2 or 3 highlights in one area. And then the next one has a real big one. Some are going to be brighter than others. Especially the ones that are on the top of these bubbles. Just sort of pronouncing the knuckles a little bit more. Okay, what I've done is just noodled away with that transparent mixture. Now I'm going in with a thicker mixture. And this is going to give me my real bright highlight. You can kind of see a difference between the two right now. Cover it once and it's there. There we go. So now we've done a finger. Now you can tint a lot of different things in here. You could go and throw in little blood veins in here and introduce red. We could make more caverns and holes in it. We could erode him out like he's rotting away. That makes him more nasty looking. There's a lot of different things. This could all be in different colors. Like anything that we've done in here, it can all be changed. Okay, so far in this project, it's been a lot of information, a lot of talking, a lot of skipping around. It's been kind of frustrating to do a project like this. So I'm just going to wing it and walk around the project a little bit and get some form and shape to this so it looks like it's a little bit pulled together. But this is where the real fun is, when you get to really open up the gun and have some fun with it. Don't be afraid in your shop or in your studio, wherever you do your art, to take those chances, to have ones that go really slow and then have ones that go really fast. Because you never know what's going to be thrown at you. And you might find that a different approach is a lot more fun than another. But you still have to keep in mind that you have to get results out of it. Notice that I haven't had a lot of tip buildup, and that's because I have the gun opened up here. I'm getting a lot of product out, it's flowing through, product's working good, the brush is working good, and that's just because I'm keeping the flow going. As soon as I cease to keep that flow going, then you start experiencing more and more difficulties. Treating these just like little mountains with a light source on one side. If that light source is coming through, what's it going to do? It's going to cast a shadow. This is where you have to be creative. Especially with your lighting and how light bounces around shapes. You can't always look after this in your drawing, although you could do a good tonal drawing. It's still a lot of it's discovered as you paint. Starting to come alive. Pushing this project is tough and it takes a lot of time. Take the time to do it right. You've got a lot of other things to consider. We haven't considered background and environment. Is this dragon in a snowstorm? Is he out in the desert? Like, where is this guy? Is he in a flaming field? If I put this guy in the middle of winter, he might freeze to death because he doesn't have enough meat on his bones to survive, so he's not believable. If I put him in the middle of the sea underwater, is that going to be believable? Not a chance. He doesn't have any fins, he doesn't have any scales that work for that. He'd have to web his claws for that to be believable. So really think about the environment he's in and what you're trying to communicate and tie all those elements together. Thinking is very important when it comes to designing a dragon. So now, how do you start this? I came with a drawing already, and you have no clue maybe how to get going on this. So I'm going to show you this. This is one of my first drawings. If I'm trying to work out a pose, I call this a thumbnail. This is where I start to develop the pose and the posture. The pose and the posture is very important. How does he carry his weight? How aggressive is he? How is he moving? Where's his weight distributed? Is he flying? Is he sitting? This is where I'm considering everything that I want to say about this guy. A book of adjectives that aren't too bad in describing a dragon. If you write down 4 or 5 things, then you try to animate it into your character. Now, if your drawing skills are weak, you're going to have to practice your drawing skills. You're going to have to get a sketchbook and you're going to have to draw and draw and draw. I was addicted to sketchbooks. I've filled hundreds of them over my lifetime. Once I like one of my thumbnails, I'll put a little star by them. I might have 20 little these guys running around. I'll put a star by my 3 favorite ones. Then I'll develop it up a little bit bigger, maybe to half size, and then immediately pick one of the 3. From that point, I draw it up a little bit bigger. And that's almost like this guy. Get him up to close to my size. Now, I can work from this size, but it might not be my end result size. That's what a photocopy or scanning it into the computer can do for you. You can print it out to the size you need, make your stencils or your transfers from that guy. At this point, in pencil, I can still work out and refine my drawing a little bit tighter. Take out areas I don't like, and from this drawing here to getting it onto the panel, I did change it quite a bit. I moved it around, I got rid of a little bit of the skull features and went a little more organic from the back of his head. I thought he was a little small in here, so I expanded the size of it. A little too much teeth, a little too much jaw, not enough cranium, so I made that a little larger on this copy. And these are things that you're always refining and tweaking as you're analyzing and looking at it to make it better. Now, this isn't the greatest drawing in the world, but I have identified my light source. There's my original light marks, showing where it's going to flow. I've also done a little tonal drawing. This is where my shadows are going to go. This gives me a lot of information in a quick, short amount of time so that I can apply it to the painting above. Do a tonal drawing, it'll help you out a lot. If you need to do a color one, go in with pencil crayons and mock it up a little bit. See what you like. Scan it into the computer. Lay some colors in there if you're a computer junkie. That can help you. So take a look at this drawing. It's a tonal drawing. I have a light source identified, and I've also carved out all my little caverns and my tones. If these tones roll around, it gives me shape and form, which I'm looking at when I'm painting this guy. When you're creating this dragon, you're a problem solver. You've got to create the environment, create the dragon, make him cooler, make him better, improve on that drawing, improve on it again, then get it down there and make it work. This is not easy. It's tough as hell. Okay, the truth is going to be in the detail. This is where you're going to be a success. I took a horn in the middle and I broke it apart so it looks like he's been beat up and battered. Now, where are you going to get this horn from? Is this the coolest horn you can do? A horn can just be as simple as one little sphere or a little cone. Try to make that horn cooler. Try to make that eyeball cooler. Try to find better teeth to work with. See how you can make that teeth the most aggressive teeth you can ever do. Are those the coolest claws that Blake can possibly draw? That's where I get to push myself and try to outdo myself more and more. Can I add more horns to him? Can I add more weapons of destruction? Can I mix other elements in there? Could he have more than one head? God, there's 3-headed dragons. Well, that might be 3 times cooler than one head. I have a better chance of being a stronger dragon if I have 3 heads as opposed to 1. Well, maybe I should have had a tail floating up here with a little spade on it and a whole bunch of weapons off of that. These guys are designed to fight. I want them to be tough, strong, armor-plated. I want them to survive everything. So if you're going to go about trying to copy this guy right here, you've missed the whole point of the DVD. The whole point was to give you enough information and show you how to create these textures on your own dude. One that's solely your guy, and make him the coolest. Reflect it upon you. Make it a part of you. And create your own that kicks this guy's ass. Just for this one dragon, we've compiled reference from reptiles, dinosaurs, and dragons. All this has come together with our own drawing to create one cool dragon. This is the proper way to work. I'm Blake McCulley from Cross-Eyed Airbrushing in Calgary, Canada. Thanks for summoning the dragon with me.